Another is the Gospel of Peter, a second-century account of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, which contains some fantastic, even bizarre elements, which again some scholars think can in part be dated back to the first century. A book edited by Princeton Seminary professor James Charlesworth entitled Jesus and Archaeology was published in 2006. It's a large book with 31 contributors comprising some 750 pages. Several of the contributors are archaeologists. Some are Jewish. In the index to scripture and ancient literature, I count more than 1,000 references to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. There are only 12 references to the Gospel of Thomas, all of them by one author, all of them in reference to a literary portrait of Jesus, nothing to do with archaeology or history. There is only one reference to the Gospel of Peter and 3 references to the Gospel of the Hebrews. The few references to these extra-canonical Gospels stand in sharp contrast to the many references to the New Testament writings. 28 of the 31 authors talking about Jesus, archaeology, and history in the pre-70 AD setting saw no point in citing extra-canonical Gospels, including the much talked about Gospel of Thomas. Now, maybe these scholars are wrong and need to go back and restudy these Gospels, especially Thomas, but I don't think so. Why is their neglect of Thomas and the others justified? It is justified because Thomas and the others provide no information about the realities of pre-70 Israel, the world in which Jesus and the disciples lived. These historians and archaeologists make use of whatever materials will aid their research. They make use of Josephus, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the New Testament writings. They make no use of the Gospels of Peter and Thomas and other extra-canonical Gospels, such as the Gnostic Gospels. I think this is a very telling point. Archaeologists and historians ignore Thomas and the others because they don't help. They don't provide accurate information about the way things really were in the first century Israel, the land of Jesus and his followers. I have never met an archaeologist who says he knew where to dig or how to understand what he unearthed because of the Gospel of Thomas. But why do historians and archaeologists rely so heavily on Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts? They do so for several reasons. One that Professor Ehrman touched upon. First, the writings are early. They date to the first century. The synoptics were written when eyewitnesses were still living, and as Richard Bauckham has argued, the sources of the Gospels were themselves shaped by the testimony of the eyewitnesses. And that's what we're talking about, the Gospels in the New Testament, not what was rumored Jesus to have said among some Christians, say in North Africa at the end of the first century. How do we know the New Testament writings date to the first century? Well, gospel stories are mentioned in Paul's writings written in the 50s and 60s. Gospel teachings are quoted or alluded to in 1 Clement written in the 90s, also in the letters of Ignatius written around 120. Traditions about the authorship of these writings are related in the fragments of Papias, whose writing dates somewhere, as already mentioned, 130, 140. Second, there is historical corroboration between the New Testament Gospels and other early sources. Several events and personalities mentioned in the Gospels and Acts are mentioned in other historical accounts, such as the writings of Josephus. Moreover, some of the teaching attributed to Jesus has been shown to be consistent with Jewish ideas in circulation prior to the emergence of the church, as we see in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is exactly what we should expect if the Gospels record the teaching of Jesus and not the later post-Easter ideas of the church. Third, the Gospels and Acts exhibit archaeological and cultural verisimilitude. That is, a likeness to the way things really were. The New Testament Gospels and Acts speak of real people like Pontius Pilate, Herod Antipas, Annas, Caiaphas, Herod Agrippa I, Herod Agrippa II, and Roman governors such as Felix and Festus. and real events, such as the painful death of Agrippa I. They speak of real places, such as cities, roads, lakes, mountains, rivers, which are clarified by archaeology or by simply visiting Israel, Turkey, and Greece. They speak of real customs, such as Passover, issues of purity, Sabbath observance. They speak of real institutions, such as the synagogue and temple, and real offices, such as priests, tax collectors, Roman centurions. And they speak of real beliefs, such as those of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Fourth, the Gospels and Acts exhibit linguistic verisimilitude. Though written in Greek, the Gospels reflect Aramaic and Hebrew influence at many points, as we should expect if they truly preserve the words of the Aramaic-speaking Jesus and his disciples. Figures of speech, grammar, and vocabulary are what we should expect if the Gospels and Acts truly preserve the words of early first-century Jewish speakers. Moreover, the Gospels and Acts exhibit authentic topography, geography, and climate. What they describe is true to the places where events are said to have taken place. In short, it is this verisimilitude in matters of language, topography, culture, and history, often corroborated by other sources, that gives historians and archaeologists confidence that the New Testament, Gospels, and Acts are sources that should be relied upon in doing research. And of course, when the archaeologist succeeds in discovering the village for which he is in search, thanks to the Gospels and Acts, this only adds to his and our confidence that the Gospels and Acts are indeed reliable sources.
Question 6. Have the Gospels been accurately preserved down through the centuries?
This is a terrific question that I have been interested in for a very long time. My first interest in this particular question about the accurate preservation of the Gospels started out when I was a student at Moody Bible Institute. At Moody Bible Institute, I believed, as did my professors, that the Bible is without error in the autographs. In other words, the originals of the New Testament did not have mistakes in them, even if subsequent copies of the New Testament may have mistakes in them. The problem is, we don't have the originals of the New Testament. What we have are thousands of copies of the New Testament that were made, in most cases, centuries later. We don't have the originals. We have copies made centuries later. These copies that were made centuries later contain numerous mistakes, thousands of mistakes, tens of thousands of mistakes, hundreds of thousands of mistakes. This was a problem for me at Moody Bible Institute, and I decided that I wanted to learn more about the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. I went to Princeton Theological Seminary to study with the foremost scholar in the field, Bruce Metzger. I devoted years of my life to this study. This has been the core of my research for the past 30 years. At some point, I came to the realization that my belief in the inerrancy of the autographs didn't make sense. If God inspired the Bible without error, why hadn't He preserved the Bible without error? I couldn't think of a good answer then, and I still can't think of a good answer now, even though I think I've heard every answer ever proposed. I couldn't any longer believe that God had inspired the originals because I was sure He had not preserved the original. Let me tell you now what I think about this entire situation, which is that we cannot know whether the Gospels have been preserved accurately through the ages, and I'm going to try and illustrate with you by explaining how it worked. Take the Gospel of Mark. Whenever Mark was written, say it was written in the year 65 or in the year 70, in the city of Rome, say, I don't know where it was made. Whoever wrote Mark put it in circulation, and somebody copied the Gospel of Mark. Then somebody copied that copy, and somebody copied the copy of the copy, then somebody copied the copy of the copy of the copy of the copy. And we don't have any of those copies. Everybody who copied the text made mistakes. Our first surviving copy of Mark probably dates to around the year 220 A.D. That is, 150 years after Mark was first produced. Our first complete copy of Mark comes from the year 350, about 280 years after Mark. We have lots of copies from later times. From thousands of years, 1,000 years after Mark, we get lots of copies. When you compare all of these copies with one another, they all differ from one another. And what is striking is that